Hey all, so we're going to pick back up with cannabis and psychosis. All right, so this is a complicated subject, and I'm just going to talk mostly about one main study that's going to be pointed to in literally everything you read that promotes the idea that cannabis can cause psychosis. I want to look closely at this study because it's been such a foundational work, and I think there's a few concerning things about it that I'm going to point out. If you want a larger overview about cannabis and psychosis, there are several papers listed. My understanding from this is that a very small amount of people who use cannabis are going to experience psychosis, and most people who experience psychosis it's because they have a vulnerability that they could possibly that they will we're going to sorry that they have a family or genetic vulnerability to schizophrenia. And it's unclear about whether or not the cannabis brought on their schizophrenia, or they're using the cannabis to sort of deal with some of their prodromal schizophrenic symptoms. So if you're not aware, schizophrenia has positive and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms are going to be things where something is added. So delusions, hallucinations, feelings of grandiosity, feelings of paranoia, all of those things are being added. There's also negative symptoms, which are things that people with schizophrenia sometimes lose. So, like the ability to show emotion on their face. So that's called a flat affect. Sometimes they have a difficulty putting together clear speech, right? They are more likely to put forth something that's called word salad, where it's basically sort of a collection of words that doesn't really have a lot of meaning. I want to be very clear, like people with schizophrenia are not usually violent. They're not particularly disruptive. It's a very small percentage, about 1%. So the psychosis that we're looking at when we see cannabis is going to be different from the psychosis that we discussed when we're looking at PCP. So let's look a little bit closer at this. So this is the main study. As you'll see, it's from 2004. This is the psychomimetic effects of intravenous delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is THC, in healthy individuals, implications for psychosis. So when they say healthy individuals, they mean that they have previously used cannabis, but have no current psychiatric diagnoses. I don't think they did any testing or asked from what I read, any questions about family predisposition to psychiatric disorders, but they are quote unquote healthy individuals. The other thing I want to point out is that there are 22 participants in this study, which is a pretty small N. All of them have used cannabis before, and as we talked about in the last video, exposure to cannabis, especially at a young age, like in early adolescence, is an increased risk for substance abuse problems in the future, as well as mental issues. So I'm sorry, when I say mental issues, I mean the development of a psychiatric disorder or psychiatric disorder. So lifetime cannabis exposures, right? So less than 5 times as the majority is 7 of them, and everybody else has been exposed a significant amount of times. The last exposure was somewhere between 1 week and several years ago, but they have all been previously exposed to cannabis. So it's not that they are naive to cannabis and this is their first time ever using it. Okay. So they use a baseline of, basically an hour before they're given a THC infusion, or a placebo infusion. So that's what the circles are. It's placebo. 2.5 milligrams of THC, which is a fairly low dose of THC, and 5 milligrams of THC. However, I do want to point out these are IV infusions. These are not people taking this through an edible. This is not people who are inhaling it. They are getting an IV infusion, which is not a normal way to be taking THC, and you might end up with the dosing here might be very different from the dosing that we would see in casual THC use. They're using a PANSS, which is a survey that they use to quantify both the positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And as you can see, after this infusion, there is a spike in those number of symptoms. We're going to look at some of the things that they said that were put into those symptom categories, but it sort of went away after 200 minutes, which is a little bit less than 4 hours, I think. Um, so you see negative symptoms as well, about just as many. I really hate when these axes are not consistent, but you do see an increase in positive and negative symptoms. So this is basically the evidence being put forth saying a single exposure to THC can bring on symptoms of psychosis. Right? So here's what people said. Here's what the participants of the study said that the experimenters quantified as being a symptom of psychosis. So suspiciousness or paranoia with loss of insight, meaning they can't see that they're being paranoid, right? They can't acknowledge the fact that, like, well, that suspicion isn't justified, or I'm being ridiculous. So paranoia is fairly common with THC use. It's also common in schizophrenia and psychosis, but usually to a greater disease. So loss of insight, meaning they've sort of lost connection with what was going on. Conceptual disorganization, disordered thoughts. That's what I was talking about with the trouble expressing your thoughts. It's not because of the problem with speech, it's because your thoughts are disordered. Thought blocking. Thought blocking is often where you feel like you can't have access to your thoughts. They're being kept from you. And the loosening of associations. So things that are closely tied or associated loses the association. So I thought you could read my mind. People being able to read your mind is a common thing that comes up in positive symptoms of schizophrenia. You were trying to trick me. You were turning the clock back to confuse me. So this could be that time distortion that we talked about as a behavioral effect of THC. I thought you were giving me THC through the blood pressure machine and the sheets. I felt as though my mind was nude, meaning like you had no ability to protect your thoughts, and there's somebody being inside of your head. Their thoughts were fragmented. Grandiosity, which is the idea of like you having an overblown view of yourself and the thing that and the purpose that you serve in the world. So things like I thought I was God, that's a grandiosity. Oftentimes grandiosity in schizophrenia comes in the form of like I'm a savior, only I can achieve this specific mission or something like that. As well as the inability to filter out irrelevant background stimuli. So this would be a negative symptom, and it is common that we see this with people with schizophrenia. They often they report getting overwhelmed by the amount of sensory stimuli coming in. So this is a problem with probably sensory motor gating and difficulty being able to do that. So these are all symptoms of schizophrenia and psychosis that we see, and they were brought on by a single dose of THC. But it's a small number. These people have all been exposed to THC before. Their family history of psychosis is not really taken into account, and the THC is being delivered by IV. If you want to hear a more comprehensive view of THC and psychosis, I would strongly recommend that you look at one of the reviews that I posted. The link between cannabis and psychosis is definitely present. However, the amount of people who experience psychosis while using THC is going to be quite low. And it's hard to it's going to be hard to tease apart how much of it is coming from like a genetic risk factor and the way that interacts with THC, or a family predisposition, or previous exposure to drugs and how THC might be bringing out some of the circuit changes that come from those previous exposures. So any drug use is going to come with a risk. Psychosis is a possible risk of cannabis, but it is not a very common one. If you are somebody who struggles with mental issues, especially anything that includes bouts of mania or psychosis, you shouldn't be using any drugs that your doctor has not prescribed to begin with. Any recreational drug use can bring forth psychotic episodes or schizophrenic episodes in people with that diagnosis. So it's always important to keep that in mind. But there is some sort of link between cannabis and psychosis. How strong that link was definitely overblown in propaganda like Reefer Madness, but it is not a non-zero number. It is a non-zero number, so we need to take that into account as we make cannabis widespread access to everybody. Okay. So that is it on cannabis research. If there's another, I know there were a lot of topics people wanted to hear about, but I'm trying to keep these videos a little bit shorter to not overwhelm you with information. I've also posted some stuff on CB2 because people had questions about that, and there's some good research coming out now. And there's a lot of research there out about how cannabis can heighten the effects of other drugs, as we looked at in cannabis and addiction. So those are all in the optional papers, optional background papers on Brightspace. And there are a few questions on Top Hat about this material that ask you to sort of take it the step forward. Right. So I will see you all on Tuesday or talk to you on Tuesday. Let me know if you have any questions.